All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to a snowy Monday. We're going to pick up where we left off today, talking about the integumentary system. We'll wrap that up and get into some cartilage and bone. In advance of class today, you had a bit of reading and you had a quiz, which was due before the class started this morning. So I hope everyone got that in. I will do my best to grade those expeditiously and get you results by, my target is by Wednesday. So in lecture, I can review how everyone did and show the kind of class histogram of the grades and everything like that. So I'll do my best to get that to you. Before we jump into today's stuff, what questions do you have about what's going on? Any questions? Who's got a name tag? Ethan, you need a name tag. All right, well, let's do it then. So today it looks like this. Oop, just kidding. Doesn't look like that. Today looks like this. We're going to continue with the appendages of the skin where we left off on Friday, talking about hair. And then I have our first edition of Human Anatomy in the News. Super exciting. I know that many of you were like excited for this all weekend. Well, your time has come, my friends. Then we're going to talk about cartilage and bone. We're going to get started on that unit and then wrap things up in a few reminders about what's going on with the lab and later this week. So this was our outline for the integumentary system. We worked through the epidermis and dermis. We left off talking about the appendages of the skin. We started talking a little bit about hair, and today we're going to continue talking about nails and glands, and we'll wrap things up. So I mentioned that humans are if we're known for one thing in the animal kingdom that we're superlative at, it is sweating. We are just awesome sweaters. And the sweat is produced by these sweat glands, which are found throughout the body. And technically, they're called Pseudiferous glands. And we normally sweat about half a liter a day. So actually, look at this. I have a water bottle here with about half a liter in it. So on a normal day, you sweat about that much. On a hot day, if you're outside and you're hot and exercising, you can sweat up to 12 liters a day, which is a lot of water, which is why it's so important to stay hydrated if you're outdoors in those conditions. Note that sweat is a blood filtrate. That means that it comes from your blood, and there's specialized cells and a specialized barrier that basically allows only water and a few other waste products to go through and keeps all of your blood cells and other things you want to keep in your body. So super important to note that it's derived from your blood. There's another fluid that is a filtrate of your blood that you excrete as well. And what is that? Yes, urine. Good. We'll talk about that later in the semester. So your sweat is about 99% water, includes some salts, and also some other, a few traces of metabolic wastes, such as urea, ammonia, and uric acid. These are byproducts from protein metabolism primarily. We don't have to worry about the details of that right now. But what I want you to note is that these are similar waste products that you are excrete in your urine as well. And your sweat is acidic also, so that helps kind of maintain your bacterial microbiome on your skin as well. So sweat is great. It's super important to us humans. As I mentioned, our problem, let me start that sentence over. As I mentioned on Friday, our problem as humans is generally staying cool enough, not staying warm enough. And one of the ways that we do that is by producing this prodigious amounts of sweat. Most mammals, in fact, don't sweat. They cool by other mechanisms. For example, dogs pant, but the exact same principle, right? You're exposing a wet surface to the air, water evaporates, and when water evaporates, that produces a cooling effect. We do it across all of our skin. Dogs gape their mouths and hang their tongues out, do it that way. Other animals have different mechanisms of using evaporative cooling to maintain homeostasis in their body temperature. Question? Chris.
12 liters is not efficient in you're expelling all that water.
Yep. That's a lot of water, right?
Yeah, no, I'm just no, I think I'm just missing something.
Okay, let me point out that this is like the extreme. I'm just kind of showing you like humans are capable of this amazing thing. This is not what you do on a daily basis. It just demonstrates how good we are at sweating if we need to. And this would be if you were outside, like let's say it's super hot and dry, and you're exercising. Like, let's say you're running a marathon in July in Arizona, right? You're going to sweat a lot. And that is super important, even though that does use a lot of water. It's super important to keep your body temperature cool, because if you overheat, even just a few degrees, you can be done for pretty quick. Good question. I'm glad you pointed that up, because it is pretty extreme. Question, Hannah.
Like, how come some people like don't sweat like as much as others when it comes to like if you're hot and like you're in a hot environment and you're exercising a lot?
Great question. And I don't know exactly the answer. Likely it has a genetic component, but I don't know. I don't know if that's been well studied or not. Some people do sweat more than others, are inclined to sweat more. I will say that it does factors that can influence that. It's different from person to person, but also your age and your physical fitness and your body shape can influence that as well. But I couldn't give you exact details about why genetically maybe some people sweat more than others. And sometimes you notice too that you feel more sweaty under certain conditions than others, even though you're sweating the same. So if it's hot and humid out, you feel really sweaty. You're like, oh man, I'm sweating a ton. But if it's hot and dry, you might not feel sweaty at all. And that's because all that sweat's evaporating as soon as you produce it, keeping you cool. And that's why, especially when it's hot and dry, it's important to keep drinking, because you don't realize you're losing all that water because you don't feel sticky from it. Sorry, I have answered your question. That's good. We should look that up though. Sure, go ahead.
What is the relationship between fitness and sweating?
So basically, as you can acclimate to exercising in hot and exercising under hot conditions, so that your body essentially becomes more efficient at producing sweat and cooling. Then there's other factors as well, being overweight, but I'm not sure. Basically what that does is when you're overweight, you have a lot of fat deposits, and that fat deposit serves as an insulator. And so you need to compensate, because all of that is insulating your body, keeping heat in. And so you need to produce more sweat to kind of relatively keep you cool. Now, it's not a direct thing. You can't just say that people with a larger body mass sweat more. There's other complicating factors, but that is part of it. Yeah. So if you have this extra insulation, it's harder to dump off that heat when you need to. So there's a couple different things at play there. Good questions. Chris, go ahead.
If it's acidic, why do the sweaty parts usually smell the worst?
That's a good question, and we're going to talk about that. Hang on to that thought. I'm going to show you why, because we produce a different kind of sweat from those particular parts. Actually, I think that's my next slide here. But yeah, look at that. Look at you got into it. Okay, so there's two types of sweat glands. There is what's called an Apocrine gland, which is what we find over most of our body, and which produces the sweat that I've been talking about so far. However, to follow up on Chris's question, we also have something called an apocrine gland. And these are associated with hair, specifically in the axillary, so your armpit, your anal, and your genital areas. And they produce a special kind of sweat that produces the special kind of sweat actually is degraded by a bacteria that then produces a musky odor. So I should be clear that the sweat itself isn't musky, but when it interacts, when it's digested by this different kinds of bacteria, it produces this musky odor. And this is kind of complicated, actually. There's lots of research showing that this odor is one of the things that helps us become attracted to certain people. So they've done studies where like people will wear a t-shirt for like a certain amount of days without showering or using deodorant, and then they'll give it to another group that like smells the shirt, and they rate the attractiveness of that odor, and then they can link that to variation in their immune system, interestingly enough. And they find that you're most attracted to the people who smell the most dissimilar to the people whose odor is the odor that's from a person whose immune system is most dissimilar to yours. So let me explain this. The idea is that you want to mate with someone and produce offspring with as much variation in your immune systems as possible, because if the more variation you have, the more you can fight off different infections. And so the idea here is that this musky odor is actually a signal for what kind of immune system you have, and you are attracted to people that have immune systems that are different from yours, so you can make babies with them that have these really strong immune systems. Now, there's some studies that kind of support this, although it's debated, it's controversial, so I don't want to say like this is how it is. But overall, there is evidence that the odors produced by the degradation of the sweat produced in these apocrine glands play an important role in mate selection in humans. Of course, we humans right now in our society do a lot to cover that up. we take showers, we use scented soaps, and we wear deodorant and all of that stuff. So I don't think this it's complicated, and we often do a lot to cover it up, but this still can play an important role in attractiveness. You know, you're out and you walk next to somebody, and for reasons you can't explain, your heart just starts throbbing. It could be because they're apocrine glands. It's neat. It's cool stuff to think about, you know, these subliminal reasons why we're attracted to some people more than others. Finally, there are also a few specialized apocrine glands that produce the wax. The two places where they're specialized, there's what's called ceruminous glands. These produce the wax in your ear canal that helps protect your ears from stuff getting in there, basically. And also, your mammary glands are modified apocrine glands. They're modified and they produce milk instead of sweat, but they're derived from the same tissue types and have very similar structure as well. So the takeaway from this slide is that there's eccrine glands that produce most of the sweat that's important for cooling. We also have apocrine glands that are found in specific areas of the body, generally where there's hair, and that these produce a sweat that's involved generally somehow, although it's a little mysterious exactly how, with finding mates. And that there's two types of specialized apocrine glands, one that produces wax in the ear canal and one that produces milk. Neat, huh? Joe, Danny, do you guys have name tags? You have them, grab them. If not, I can give you a paper here. Who else is missing them? Thanks. All right, that's all I'm going to say. That covers the integumentary system. Any questions on anything so far? There's a bit, well, yeah, that's, I think, all I want to say right now. Okay, so human anatomy in the news. So there's a study that's out. This is a couple years old at this point, but it ties into what we're talking about. A study that used a huge data set of people's genome, their gene sequences from the UK, asking the question, what makes hair red? And what they found is that, let me show a picture of some red-haired folks. You probably have seen them around. That what's important to note is that, as I mentioned, hair color is produced by these specialized cells called melanocytes. And the color is determined by the ratio of the two kinds of melanin it produces, eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin, as I have here, is dark, generally produces brown or dark hair, and pheomelanin produces blondish or reddish hair. And it's the ratio of these two melanins that determines your hair color. There's kind of some other things going on there too, but in general, we can think of it as the ratio of these two types of melanins. Now, what's really important to note is that it's not a difference in the number of melanocytes or even in the amount of melanin produced that changes color. What's different is the kind of melanin and the ratio of the melanins that's produced. All of this, or I shouldn't say all of this, this is largely determined by a gene called MC1R. So if you have certain variants in the MC1R gene, you'll produce more pheomelanin and you'll end up with like Ron Weasley here. And if you have a variant that produces more eumelanin, you'll have hair that looks more like, I guess, Harry Potter. He's not shown there, but you've all seen Harry Potter, I'm sure, somewhere. Has darker hair. So the takeaway message here is it's the ratio of these kinds of melanins that's produced. But what's interesting is that it's not just that. There's other important genes too, and there's like 200 of them that influence hair color. So some folks that have a high pheomelanin to eumelanin ratio don't in fact have red hair, but they have blonde hair, and that's because of the interactions with other genes. So as with all things genetic, it's complicated. But the primary gene is this MC1R gene that controls the ratio of those two melanin types. I put Percy and I was tempted to cut out Percy, but I guess he turns out okay later anyway. Questions? Yeah, Ethan.
You said a lot of pheomelanin is red or blonde?
Well, both actually, and whether it's and you end up being a redhead or blonde is largely determined by these interactions with other genes. Mm-hmm. But you need a lot of pheomelanin to be a redhead. Mm-hmm. Brooke.
What kind of happens with these melanocytes? Like some people have like really light hair like growing up, and then like as they get older, their hair gets darker.
Why does it change? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, it's pretty common that your hair gets darker as you get older as well in some folks. Yeah, I don't know the reason for that. That's another one to look up, like what changes over development. I have some guesses, but they're just guesses. Chris, go ahead.
I did the complete opposite. I was born with black hair.
Yep, and it got lighter.
I'm blonde now.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so there's some kind of developmental change. My guess is that you're changing the ratio of these two melanins, but I don't know exactly how that's tied with development or whatever. Yeah, babies sometimes they're born with like really wispy hair, like light hair. So good questions. Sorry, I don't know the answers. I should take a note. I say sometimes that I'll get back to you and then I forget what the question was. So let me actually write this down so I can get back to you. What was the first question that, Hannah, you had a question I kind of answered.
Why do some people sweat more than others?
Oh. All right. There we go. If I don't write things down, they just kind of evaporate from my brain, unfortunately. Good questions. Let's talk about cartilage and bone. So this is kind of our next, I'll call unit in class. This is covering the skeletal system. And to cover this, I made a study guide for you about bone and cartilage. And so this is a link to a Google Doc. You can grab that and it provides kind of a structure for you to take notes as well as some images and some other things. If you want to use it, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. This isn't an assignment. This is a resource. I just want to be clear, just a way to set things up to make it easier for you to take notes. If you want to, here, let me do this too. I will put the link in your next class program too, or I'll send it out over email to make sure you have it on your computers too. It's maybe not as useful on your phone, but you can get it now and send it to yourself or whatever. So anyway, you can take a look at that. It has some information there and some places for you to fill in information. Everyone got that? Make sure you got the QR code. And then later in class, I'll ask you if that's helpful or not. You can tell me if it's helpful feedback for the remainder of the semester, if these kinds of the study guide's helpful for you. So cartilage and bone, we're going to introduce it, just some general concepts. I'm going to talk about the structure of cartilage and bone at a cellular level, and then we'll talk a little bit about bone healing and as well as bone disorders. Note here that the lecture component of class isn't going to cover what bones are what. That's all going to be covered in labs. And our next two labs will be on the skeletal system. You'll be learning all the bones of the skull and the different kinds of vertebrae and all the bones in the arms and legs and all of that. In lecture, I'm going to cover general concepts about how bones work and what they do. And in lab, we'll learn the names of all the specific bones. So often, mistakenly, the skeletal system is thought of as just a static structure, something that supports the body and serves as an attachment point for muscles. But what I really want to emphasize is that these bones are dynamic living tissues. They do a whole bunch of stuff in addition to provide structure. And they're dynamic in the sense that bone tissue is constantly being broken down and rebuilt. Your bones are constantly regenerating themselves, often in response to the kinds of exercise that you're doing and the kind of stressors you put on them. And that's really important to understand as we think about how your skeletal system ages. So these are dynamic organs that do a lot of stuff beyond just provide structure. That's the big takeaway. So let's look at how that works. And first, I want to talk about cartilage. We have three primary types of cartilage in our body, and you see them in different colors here. And I'll walk through this. First, we have what's called hyaline cartilage. This is kind of the most common, and it's found in joints and articulations, like covers the bones in your joints so the bones don't rub on each other. Hyaline cartilage is super smooth. It's actually called hyaline because it kind of looks like ice and actually has a friction coefficient that's less than ice. So it's actually smoother than ice. It allows these surfaces to rub on each other without binding, without creating friction. We also find this in your costal cartilage. So this is what attaches your ribs to your sternum. We're going to talk about the ribs and sternum in more detail, but you can see the cartilage there. Next, we have what's called fibrocartilage. This is a really kind of tough cartilage that can withstand a lot of tension and compression. And we find this in a few places in the body. It's what's in your intervertebral discs. So these are the discs of cartilage that are between your vertebrae. Now, interestingly, these are derived from the notochord. I mentioned the notochord is that kind of primitive tissue that's found across vertebrates. And I said, as you grow up, as you mature, that notochord goes away essentially by birth, except for that tissue is what becomes these intervertebral discs. We also find fibrocartilage in a couple other places, the meniscus of the knee, because that is a joint that bears a lot of weight and stress as we run and move. And also in what's called the pubic symphysis. This is the joint between your two the anterior joint of your two coxal bones. We'll look at these structures in lab in more detail, but just know that there's this fibrocartilage there for now. And finally, we have elastic cartilage. This is in green. There's two places in the body where we're going to talk about this. One, it can't really see here, but is your epiglottis, the little flap that makes sure that you don't choke when you eat food and that food doesn't go down your windpipe. And also in your ears, you've got this cool kind of cartilage that's super flexible and resilient, but also really stiff in your ears. And that is a kind of cartilage called elastic cartilage. One note, let me get your question 1 second, Hannah, is that I just want to make sure this is clear. So we have connective tissue, right? We have a kind of connective tissue called elastic connective tissue. And then we have a kind of connective tissue, all cartilage is connective tissue, right? And there's a kind of cartilage called elastic cartilage. I just want to make it clear that there's two kinds of connective tissue that have the word elastic in their name, and they're different. Elastic connective tissue is different from elastic cartilage. So make sure you're keeping those straight. That'll be important in lab tomorrow too. We'll see examples of both under the microscope slide. So just know it's a little bit confusing. Did I just talk about this? I did that already. Okay, there you go. Hannah, you had a question.
Yeah. What did you say for fiber cartilage and what the function was?
Fibrocartilage is kind of a tougher, denser cartilage. I'm going to show you details of it in just a second, but it's in places in the body that is kind of continually bearing a lot of pressure. So in your knees, every time you walk or run, in these intervertebral discs, which bear the weight of your torso down your body, and then also in this joint here, which bears a lot of weight as well. Other questions? All right, let's look at these. Let's talk about cartilage generally, and then we'll get into some details of the different types. So cartilages have structural similarities, and what I want to talk about the things that they all have in common, and then we'll talk about detail about the three different types of cartilage. So the types of cells that produce cartilage, or that are cartilage cells, are called chondrocytes, and they are located in what's called lacunae. These lacunae means comes from the word, I think comes from the word for lake actually, but it's like a little space, right? And so you can see all of these little chondrocytes in their little lacunae, their little space. And in between all of that space, you have what's called a matrix. And the matrix contains two things. It contains these fibers, and there's different kinds of fibers. For example, here we have what's called elastic fibers. We also have collagen fibers. And then also what's called a ground substance. The ground substance is kind of a liquidy or gelatinous goop, for lack of a more scientific word. So we have chondrocyte cells in their little cavities, in their little holes called lacunae. Surrounding that, we have a matrix. That matrix includes a ground substance, which is liquid or gelatinous, and fibers, different kinds of fibers. So that's the big takeaway from the structure of cartilage tissue. Pericardium is the tissue that surrounds cartilages and resists outward pressure and also helps in repair. And it's a kind of irregular, dense, irregular connective tissue. And that's going to make a little more sense. We're going to look at that on our microscope slide tomorrow in lab. So basically you have this, it's like a capsule surrounding the cartilage that helps it keep shape. So think of like, you know, those like little like stress toys that are kind of gooey and you can kind of squeeze it and then it goes back to its shape. And it has like gel in the middle and then like a thing on the outside. It's kind of like that. It's not quite that squishy, but that's the idea, is that you have this dense, irregular connective tissue surrounding the cartilage to give it shape. Importantly, cartilage is mostly anywhere from 60 to 80% water. And this water makes it very springy and allows it to spring back to its shape. Water, as you know, can't be compressed, or it's very difficult to compress water. So it allows it to like change shape, but then go back to that shape after the pressure is released. And this is why, importantly, it's important to stay hydrated if you are doing, if you're an athlete or doing something strenuous and you're losing water. What happens if you lose a lot of water, your cartilage can become dehydrated and it loses some of these characteristics, and then you can more easily injure it. So for example, in your knees or your hips or something like that, if you're dehydrated, you're more prone to injuring the cartilage in those joints. And once you injure the cartilage in those joints, it's really difficult to repair because cartilage is avascular and doesn't fix itself very well. So it's another reason that it's important to stay hydrated. And we don't necessarily associate hydration with injury like that, but it is because it's so much water, it's susceptible to dehydration. Yes, please.
So the cartilage, like for example, it's in your knee.
Yes.
Or like in your hip. So obviously you said it can't regenerate very well. So then how come some people just like when they go to like a surgeon, they tell them like, oh, it's kind of actually like really bad. Like you still have cartilage there, but it's like they're basically telling you that it won't grow back. Even though like, it does grow slowly.
Yeah, so it has very limited repair ability. And so once it goes down, once you damage it, it just doesn't come back. And I know this firsthand. From the cartilage in my hips was basically just like disappeared on me. And so there was no way to like really repair it. They're using some new techniques. Actually, I'll show you in class maybe later this week where they can harvest cartilage from other places in your body. They're trying some new ways to replace it, but generally once it's gone, that's why they have like knee replacement surgery at a certain point. Like you just can't fix the knee anymore. You just have to replace the whole darn thing, or a hip replacement or something like that. Yep. Yeah, but ideally, as long as there's genetic component to that, but there's also, if you're doing things properly and healthily and you're staying hydrated and all of that stuff, hopefully you won't damage that cartilage in the long term. And of course, some exercises and some activities are more likely to damage that cartilage than others. So it just depends on what it is. So for example, like running can put a lot of stress on the cartilage in your knees compared to say swimming or something like that. Like you don't see cartilage damage in swimming athletes, swimmers, what do you call these people? Swimmers, yeah, just swimmers, because there's not that kind of constant impact and pressure on it. Whereas runners very often have knee problems, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of did.
Yeah.
I worked in an office, or was working with orthopedic surgeon.
Okay.
And all the time at a clinic, like they talk about like we're not saying this or that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just hard because it just doesn't repair itself very well. It can somewhat, but the tissue by and large just doesn't do well to take care of itself. Unlike bone or something like that, which can repair itself quite well. Cool. All right, let's talk about hyaline cartilage. So I mentioned there's 3 kinds of cartilage. Hyaline is the most abundant, as I mentioned. In hyaline cartilage, the chondrocytes are kind of spherical. Again, we'll see this in more detail tomorrow. And note in the matrix there, the only kind of fiber is collagen. And it holds a lot of water. And this provides not only reduces friction at the joints, but also provides a lot of support for those joints and keeps them stable, right? So it keeps your joints from getting out of socket. So we find this on the ends of your long bones at joints. As I mentioned, the costal cartilage, which is the cartilage that connects your rib cage to the sternum, the bone in the middle of your chest. We also find this in the nose. So this is the cartilage. If you go right here and hold this, you got some hyaline cartilage right up there. And also in your trachea, it provides structure and support to your trachea and also your bronchi as well. And that's all I'm going to say about hyaline cartilage right now. I'm just going to kind of introduce some of these cartilages, and you'll see them. I keep saying this, but we'll look at them tomorrow in lab. Tomorrow's lab's going to be awesome. I don't know if it'll really be awesome, but it'll be a lab. We'll make it awesome. It's up to us, really. We determine how awesome lab is. All right, am I good to move on to the next one? All right, elastic cartilage. So the ground substance for elastic cartilage contains this other kind of fiber called elastic fibers. And so far, we have two fiber types. We have collagen, and we have these elastic fiber types. And so that kind of makes sense. It's elastic fiber types in elastic cartilage. And this tolerates repeated bending very well. And as I mentioned, there's only a couple places you have this. Your external ear is the best example. You can flop this guy around all day and the cartilage stays pretty firm and keeps your ear in shape. But I noticed though, what's interesting is you can get like a floppy ear from wearing a mask all day. I don't know if anyone's experienced this. If your mask is a little too tight, your ears just start to go like this. And then at the end of the day, you can feel your ear like super wobbly. It's kind of gross, but kind of cool too. But then like by the next day, it bounces back. So that is your elastic cartilage doing its job for you. Of course, it didn't evolve to hold masks on our faces, but it keeps that ear structure open, which increases your hearing capacity, of course, and allows you to detect directionality of sound, importantly. But think about if your external ear was made of bone or something like that, at some point in your life, you probably would have cracked it and broke it and would be all misshapen and whatnot for all of us. But this elastic cartilage gets bonked around all the time. And unless you're a rugby player, it generally holds up pretty well. That's elastic cartilage. I got one more type of cartilage here, and that's fibrocartilage. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a tougher kind of cartilage. It's in between these two elastic and hyaline cartilage in structure. And we only have this in a few places as well. And that is, as I mentioned, the pubic symphysis in your knee, and in these intervertebral discs in a structure called the Annulus Fibrosis. And I'll go back to the diagram here to show you that stuff in a second. And it's these the annuli or Annulus Fibrosis. That's the derivative of the notochord from early in development. So we go back to our body here, and this is the same slide that I showed you earlier, but just as a review, now that you kind of know a little bit more about each of those cartilage types, kind of map out where they are in the body. And let me just skip ahead 1 second. I just want to see what I have lined up here. Okay, perfect. And I want to show you one more diagram. This shows you your respiratory system and a few more places where you have different kinds of cartilage. I mentioned elastic cartilage is in your ear and your epiglottis. So you can see that there. And then you can see in blue all of this important hyaline cartilage that gives structure to those respiratory, to your airways, basically. And that is associated with the larynx. You have what's called the thyroid cartilage. And then you have what's called the cricoid cartilage that again provides structure for the trachea. I don't need you to know the names of thyroid cartilage or cricoid cartilage. What I want you to know is that it's hyaline cartilage that provides structure to your airways. And you can see that there's these bands of cartilage that go all the way down into these bifurcating airways in the lungs. And that allows them to stay open and keep that structure, even as the pressure in them changes as you inhale and exhale. Sure, go ahead.
What do you mean by fibrocartilage intermediate?
What I mean by that is that its structure at a cellular level has some qualities of both hyaline and elastic cartilage. And as I put that slide up, I was regretting it because I haven't told you what those structures are yet. So when you see these in lab tomorrow, we'll see in more detail what those two cartilages look like. And you'll see how fibrocartilage is kind of like hyaline, but also kind of like elastic. I'm just going to leave that at that for now. And then tomorrow we'll look at it in more detail. Yeah, it's a great question. Dun, dun, dun. Questions on cartilage. That's all we're going to say about cartilage. We're just cranking through this. We can finish this class by March if we keep this up, guys. And we'll just be done for a couple, like April, we'll just kind of hang out. I don't know what we'll do. Get breakfast burritos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. All right, let's talk about bone then. Bone is pretty cool, and I want to just emphasize how cool it is. So it provides a diversity of functions, as I mentioned, the first of which you're familiar with. It provides structure and support to your body. Now, actually, let me see one thing here. Oh, yeah, that's cool. Okay. So it provides the framework for your body. If you didn't have bones, you'd be just kind of a glob on the ground. I guess you'd have some structure from cartilage, but you know. Also provides a lever arms for movement. So your skeletal muscle, as you might guess, almost not always, but generally attaches to bone, and it moves those bones to provide movement of your appendages, of your torso, et cetera, et cetera. Your bone also protects organs. So you have your sternum and your rib cage, right, protecting your thoracic cavity here, your lungs and your heart. But also you have this exquisite capsule around your brain made of bone that protects it, called your skull. And it provides, it protects your brain from outside, what's the word I'm looking for? Forces? Contact with the outside world. It protects it. And also bone is important for mineral storage. So as I mentioned, it's very dynamic tissue, and especially calcium and phosphate are stored in the bone. And then when your body needs those minerals, they can be released from the bone into circulation for other places where they're needed. Also, your blood cells, you have red marrow in your bones where your blood cells grow up in our, it's like a blood cell nursery kind of, where all the little blood cells run around and do their little blood cell thing until they become big mature blood cells and then released in the bloodstream. And they spend their lives without a nucleus carrying oxygen around your body, which is a good way to live. We also have what's called yellow marrow in your bones, and this is fat storage, right? And so that's actually an energy store. You can degrade this tissue, you can metabolize this tissue and use it for energy if needed, which is cool. We don't think of our bones as being an energy source. And finally, your bones are also an endocrine organ. They secrete a hormone called osteocalcin that plays an important role in regulating your blood sugar. It interacts with your pancreas and the production of insulin to maintain proper glucose levels in circulation. And actually, this is a recent discovery. We're just kind of now understanding the role of this hormone in maintaining glucose balance in folks. And so it's an important regulator of metabolism, deciding where glucose gets burned and where it gets stored and this kind of thing. So bones are doing all this stuff. They're really cool. And let me see, what time is it? I got a little more time here. I'm going to keep going. Now, what I want to emphasize too is I'm going to talk about bone tissue, but bones themselves are an organ, and they contain a whole bunch of tissue types, basically all the other tissue types except for muscle. So they contain a number of kinds of connective tissue. For example, your bone itself, the bone tissue, is connective tissue. It has an organic component, which are these cells and fibers and ground substances. But also your bone, importantly, has an inorganic component, and that's these mineral salts that that make it hard, right? There are these crystals that form that make your bones really hard. So that's one type of connective tissue in your bone organ. So remember here, we're talking about the bone as an organ. We're talking about the different tissue types in the bone organ. One of those tissue types is bone tissue. A little bit confusing because we have a name and a name. I want to make sure that's clear. We also have cartilage. As I mentioned earlier, especially hyaline cartilage covers the bones at the ends at joints and provides the surface for those articulations, so like elbow, shoulder, wrist, knee, et cetera, et cetera. We have blood in our bones. It's highly vascularized tissue. So that's another kind of connective tissue. We also have nervous tissue. So remember, this is the fourth kind of tissue, or third kind, I guess, doesn't matter. And we have your bones are innervated, meaning that there's nerve cells traveling, delivering signals to and from the bones. And then also we have epithelial tissue, which lines the blood vessels that are in the bone. So the takeaway message here is that bones as an organ contain all of these different kinds of tissue with the exception of muscle tissue. I'm going to pause there, let you get that down. I've got a couple more slides we'll cover today. Ethan.
I've got a bit random question, but still related to bones.
Okay.
So with that part of them regulating metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
is that what, if you get like HIV or AIDS, like the stereotypical thing you see is somebody very skinny?
Is that
part of the reason why they become so skinny?
Oof.
That?
I don't know the answer. There's other reasons. Partially, it has to do with your immune system, the activation of your immune system. But I don't know. That's a good question if it's related to that at all. And osteocalcin, it's a pretty new hormone that is recently discovered and just being understood. So I don't even know if anybody knows the answer to that. That's a good question. I would imagine it certainly could play a role, especially if that those tissues are infected that are producing that particular hormone. So, I never made that connection. Other questions I can't answer. Cool. All right, let's talk a little more about bone tissue. As with cartilage, bone has this matrix surrounding it, right? And it has some unique properties. So about a third of it is organic components, and that is like your fibers and your ground substance. But 65% of it is this inorganic component that provides this hardness and resist compression. This is why bones are so hard, right? And specifically, we have something called hydroxyapatites, especially calcium phosphate. I'm not going to get into the chemical structure of this. The takeaway message here is that 2/3 of bones is hard stuff, and that hard stuff is inorganic. And that's what I want you to know. I'm not gonna ask you the chemical makeup of calcium phosphate or anything like that. The takeaway message is that 2/3 of the bone is hard inorganic material that gives it this really, really strong, rigid structure. Rigid, but also a little bit flexible. Let me see if I want to cover this slide. Actually, that's a good spot because the 4 types of bone cells is a little bit much. We can start off our next class with that. So let me stop here. I got a few announcements and reminders before we go, but let me just see what other questions you might have. This class has good questions. I love it.
Would adipose not be considered one of the tissues present in bone because it's stored in that yellow marrow?
That's a good question. There is, so to answer that, adipose tissue is another type of connective tissue on here. I should have that on the list.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'll see that. When do I have that? I think coming up in the next lecture, we'll talk about that. That's a great call there. All right, well, let me skip ahead here a few things. Don't worry about anything I'm going to show right now. This is like a preview. It's like a trailer for what's coming on Wednesday. You get we should have some dramatic music and like a voiceover. Coming on Wednesday, more on bones. 4 types of bone cells. One of them is derived from immune cells. Which one is it? Okay. Lab tomorrow. Don't forget on Tuesday. I want to remind you that you have a quiz in lab tomorrow that will cover last week's lab. So it's 10 points from last week's lab. That will cover your body cavities, directional terms. So that's like distal, proximal, lateral, medial, superior, inferior, all that. Body cavities is, there is the handouts, but there's a lot of them. And that's everything from thoracic, abdominal, pelvic, cranial, cervical, et cetera, to carpal and axillary, all of that stuff. So make sure you know those terms. You know body planes. So the planes are your sagittal, transverse, and frontal or coronal plane. And then also, it's kind of weird on their cat skin. Know especially the layers of the cat skin that you remove from your cat and which is which. So that's the dermis, the epidermis. Well, I guess going in order, superficial to deep, we'd want to say epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, the fascia, the deep fascia, and then the muscle tissue there. So just know those layers and be able to identify them. Question, yes.
2 questions. 1,
2.
Body cavities, like, are those on the visible body that we can go back to
Yep, it's everything that you covered last week in lab. So there's two things. There's the PDF that I created that has a whole bunch of terms on it for you and kind of walks you through them. But then there's also those visible body blog posts. There's one on planes, and then I think there's one on directional terms and one on body cavity. I don't remember if there's one on body cavities or not, but there is that was in the PDF that I provided. Yep.
The second one was with regards to the plane, so like the coronal, I thought that was the same as the front, or not front, but the transverse plane.
The coronal is going to be, am I mixing this up? The transverse, the coronal and frontal are the same. Yep, because it's like a crown, I guess.
Right,
Mhm. Yep, and then transverse is cutting this way, so you get a superior, inferior, and then sagittal is when you get left and right. And no oblique as well. Oblique is just kind of anything that's not one of those, like in some other angle. And also be sure to know parasagittal versus mid-sagittal. So mid-sagittal is directly down the middle. Parasagittal is the same plane, but just offset a little bit, so it's not split evenly between left and right. Also, as a reminder, I have open hours today from noon to 2 in our lab room. Stop by. You can review any of this stuff for the quiz tomorrow. We can talk about whatever review you want to do. I'll be there for a couple hours this afternoon. Otherwise, thanks for a great class today. I'll stick around if we have a question. Yeah, Hannah. Oh, no, this is not open note. Yep, sorry. None, let me think for a second before I say this. None of your lab quizzes will be open note. Yep. Yep. Thanks for asking that. It's going to be kind of a combination. It's like a hybrid. We're going to do it together, and I have slides and demonstrations and things that you'll be doing. So lab quizzes are generally pretty interactive. This one I don't have. Usually you'll be looking at like specimens and things. For this one, I've got some diagrams and some other stuff that I'll show you.
Are you taking that first?
Yeah, we'll do that right away. Yep, get it out of the way. Questions? Yes. Say again. We're gonna do it together, and so it's probably just 10 minutes. It's only 5 questions, so 2 points each, so it's pretty quick. So 5-10 minutes. But you won't have a time limit either, if that makes sense. If you need to take more time, then that's fine. Chris, go ahead. Oh, here, I can catch it. Nice. I've got it. I was actually surprised that I got. Yeah, thank you, Ethan. Appreciate that. All right, I'll stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow in lab. Thank you, everybody.